Hello, STEM, American Government and Politics class. This is Mr. Strahota. It is Thursday, March 26th, 2020. We are moving on to the next unit, Unit 4, which is on the role and purpose of political parties. If you pay attention at all to politics, which with my class we have been, you have realized that there is a two-party system in the United States dealing primarily with Republicans and Democrats and what their roles are in politics. Now, as your teacher, my job is not to sway you to support one side or the other. My job is simply to tell you what their role is, what typically their beliefs are, depending on which political party they're affiliated with, and what the purpose of political parties are in the United States government system. So, first of all, what is a political party? It's a group of people who seek to control government by winning elections and holding office. So obviously, if you support Republicans, you want more Republicans to hold office. If you support Democrats, you want more Democrats to support to be in offices, whether it is in the House of Representatives, whether it's in Senate, or whether it's the president. And this can also branch off into governors of states as well as state House members and state senators. America then, like I mentioned, has two major parties. That is the Republicans and the Democrats, and we will get into their differences here shortly. And the parties can be principle-oriented, issue-oriented, or election-oriented. So this meaning, depending on which side you favor, you're typically going to side with their stance on an issue. So if you are really big on guns rights, you're going to favor more Republicans. If you want more gun control, you're going to favor more towards Democrats. And again, I just use the gun debate because that's a really popular debate in our society today. So again, I'm not taking any stance on it, and I'm not telling you to take any stance on it, but again, that's just kind of a simple example I go to because both the Republicans and Democrats have very different opinions on the Second Amendment. I digress. So what do political parties do? So there's 5 things that political parties are going to do. First of all, they nominate candidates. And I will get into all these with a little bit more detail in a second. They inform and activate supporters. They act as a bonding agent, and I will get into what that means. They govern, of course, and they act as a watchdog. So let's jump into these 5 quickly. So nominating candidates. So right now we have a presidential election this coming November in 2020, where the Republican candidate will most likely be President Trump, and the Democratic candidate is coming down to currently either Bernie Sanders or Joe Biden, and it appears that Joe Biden, who was the vice president under President Obama, will most likely be the Democratic candidate, but that could change. But the major function of a party is to recruit, select, and present candidates for public office. So the Democrats have been spending the last, I would say roughly 18 months or so, kind of having debates with different Democratic candidates, and then narrowing it down to now we're down to basically the last 2. We've been talking throughout the school year this year as certain candidates have dropped out because, again, it takes a lot of money, a lot of time, and a lot of traveling around, and it takes a lot of work and money to run for a political office, especially president. So the job of these different political parties is to choose the best candidate who they feel has the best chance of winning because, of course, if you are a political party, you want your people to be voted in because you want their influence on the government system. Informing supporters, if you have not noticed, which I'm sure most of you have, whether you're watching YouTube or whether you're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, you will be getting ads from different political parties and candidates as elections are getting closer. So this is, of course, the political party informing you of who their candidates are and what they stand for. So first of all, they define and take stances on important issues. They campaign for their candidates, which, like I just mentioned, they will buy out ads to put on different platforms such as social media. Sometimes you'll get them still in the mail, which is more old school, but that's how you'll still get some in the mail today. They'll typically give you a website for their candidate to do some research and to promote their candidate because, let's be honest, a lot of people don't do a ton of research on candidates. So if nobody puts something in your hands or puts something right in front of you, you might not know who somebody is. So it is the political party's job to let the public know who their candidate is and what they stand for. And they can also criticize, you see this a lot, they will criticize other candidates of their positions. So you'll see this a lot in TV commercials where one candidate will take a quote that another candidate said, and they will kind of smear their opponent to try to make them look really bad because, again, they're trying to get your vote. So they want to make the other candidate look bad so their candidate looks good. This happens a lot in politics. It's not always very fun or fair oftentimes, but that is their role and that is what they're trying to do. A bonding agent. So what does a bonding agent mean? Well, this is where they're vouching for a candidate that is worthy of office. So they are trying to say, look, this person would be the best person for this role in political office, and this is why. So kind of like glue, that political party is going to try to stick to their candidate and try to make you stick to them, hypothetically, and want them to vote for that candidate. And they want to prove that they're trustworthy, of good character, capable of the job, etc. So it is basically promoting that person and saying, look, this is the best person you could vote for in this position. Do not vote for the other person. Our candidate is better, and this is why. Governing. Of course, political parties are supposed to govern, so the executive and legislative branch must work together. So again, our executive is led by the president. Legislative is our Congress, which consists of the House and the Senate. And they need to work together to get things done because, as we've talked about earlier in the year, we have checks and balances in place, and we can't get laws passed or legislation passed unless there's agreement on all three branches, or at least majority agreement from all three branches. Bipartisan actions are supported by both parties. That means both the Republicans and Democrats agree on an issue, which they just did in passing the bill to help with the coronavirus, and they're going to be pumping some money into the economy by putting money in people's hands. So that was a bipartisan action where both Republicans and Democrats had to agree to an item. And lastly, partisanship is a firm allegiance to party and can cause gridlock. So we see this a lot in politics where if a Republican brings up a topic, all the Republicans will agree with them, and you'll see the Democrats disagree, or vice versa. If a Democrat brings up a bill to vote on, all the Democrats will agree, but sometimes the Republicans will not. So they get in this gridlock of they're kind of just bashing heads going back and forth. The little cartoon on the bottom I found funny. So the bill has bipartisan support, meaning both Republicans and Democrats like it. The only group that doesn't like it is the public, which you will see sometimes Congress will pass a bill and then the majority of the public will not like or agree with it. A watchdog. So this means that when parties are out of power, which means, for example, currently we have a Republican president, so this means the Democratic Party will police the actions of the opposite political party. So if Republicans dominate Congress, the Democrats will be policing them, or vice versa. They will also try to sway public opinion in their own favor, which means if one party is doing something wrong, they will really try to market that and say, look at how bad of a job they're doing. We can do this so much better. Please elect us into office when the next elections come around. So again, you'll see this a lot, especially when elections are coming up too. And then the role of loyal opposition is important, meaning that you're going to stay loyal to your political party. Don't waver. Stay strong with whatever party you're in agreement with. And that can be important. As you can see, we are better than this is on the sign over here, which is basically saying our side is better than the other side. Make sure you vote our candidate in when the next election comes. So America's two-party system. You might be asking yourself, why are we only a two-party system? Why are there not other parties? Well, historical basis, America began with two parties, the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, which we talked about earlier in a previous unit, where the Federalists were in favor of a strong central government, Anti-Federalists were in favor of a weaker central government. Anti-Federalists, again, also favored stronger states' rights. Tradition can be strong, especially when it comes to America. We've had a two-party system because we've always had it that way. Minor parties have never found a lot of success, so people are reluctant to support them. If you were 18 years old or older and the election was coming up in November, it would be really hard for you to talk yourself into voting for a third party because you would probably tell yourself, well, my vote's not really going to count if I vote for a third party because the odds of a Republican or a Democrat candidate winning are almost 100%. So you will still see people vote for third parties, but again, those typically can be looked at as kind of throwaway votes because unfortunately, we have a two-party system that dominates everything, and that vote would probably not be worth much because the chances of you winning anything for your candidate is going to be very slim. The electoral system, certain features of government, such as single-member districts, are designed to favor two major parties. So, as we've talked about, our electoral college system, you get votes based off of how many senators your state has and how many representatives your state has. So, if a Republican candidate wins in Wisconsin or a Democratic candidate wins in Wisconsin in the 2020 election, that party gets all of those electoral votes. So, that means that for a third party to come in and win in a state, they would need to get the majority of the votes in the state to win any electoral votes, which is very difficult to do. So the electoral system really favors that two-party system as well. And then an ideological consensus. Most Americans have a general agreement on fundamental matters. Conditions that would spark strong rival parties don't exist. So at this point in your life, you most likely are swaying either one side or the other. Or maybe you're in the middle, which is totally fine too. But typically, both parties, both Republican and Democratic parties, have taken strong stances on certain issues, and you can probably pick one of those parties as your party that you agree with the most because the different topics and issues and the different stances those two parties take on. So it doesn't really favor you to choose another party because you can probably find that issue being supported or not supported by one of the two major parties. And here's just kind of a funny cartoon of our Republican Party and our Democratic Party, a Republican Party being visualized by an elephant and the Democratic Party being visualized by a donkey, and they're kind of just sitting on the doorstep just kind of waiting for a third party to show up, which really hasn't happened a whole lot in our political history. So a multi-party system. So we see some different parties down here that represent different parties. So what are the advantages of a multi-party system? Well, this would provide a broader representation of the people. So having only two parties, that means you need to choose a side, right? You need to choose the Republican side or the Democratic side. You can vote for a different party, but again, like I mentioned earlier, it's difficult to determine how valid your vote's going to be if you don't vote for a Republican or a Democrat because the likelihood of a Republican or Democrat winning are very high. This would be more responsive to the will of the people. So again, if we had more parties, they could take more stronger takes on different issues. Whereas if there's only two parties, if you don't agree with one or the other, you still kind of have to pick one because the odds of, again, like I mentioned, of another party winning are pretty slim. And then give voters more choices at the polls. So, again, I know I'm kind of beating a dead horse here, but if you vote for somebody besides a Republican or a Democrat, your vote's probably not going to be worth much because the odds of your candidate winning are pretty slim. Disadvantage of a multi-party system. Possibly more influence of extremists. Again, extremist groups could come in and take a really strong stance on an issue. And again, as we've seen in history, sometimes extremist political parties do not have the best interest in mind of the majority of the public. Parties form coalitions which can dissolve easily, and failure of coalitions can cause government instability. So if a certain political party fell through while they were in power, that would really cause a lot of problems. So as you can see, there are advantages and disadvantages to a multi-party system. Currently, we're, of course, dominated by two. I'm curious if we'll ever have a strong third party make an appearance. I guess we will just have to wait and see. What were America's first parties? Like I mentioned earlier, we had Federalists and Anti-Federalists. Anti-Federalists, also known as Democratic Republicans. Federalists were led by John Adams, whereas the Democratic Republicans were led by Thomas Jefferson. Federalists, they represented cities and upper-class interests, whereas Democratic Republicans represented farmers and the common man. Federalists were in favor of a strong executive branch and a loose interpretation of the Constitution, whereas Democratic Republicans favored a strict interpretation of the Constitution. This is John Adams, this is Thomas Jefferson. Again, this would be Federalists or Anti-Federalists. But again, Thomas Jefferson then founded the Democratic Republicans. Political eras over time. So, era of the Democrats. So from 1800 to 1860, the Democrats really dominated all but two of the presidential elections. There used to be a Whig Party, which emerged in 1834, but it declines with the 1850s, and they elected only two presidents. And the Republican Party then is founded in 1854. So political eras over time, era of the Republicans then, they are going to dominate a lot of elections from 1860 to 1932. They will dominate all but four presidential elections during that time period. The Democratic Party maintained state and local power in the solid South. So you'll see this sometimes on geographic maps if you're looking at elections or presidential elections. You can see some similarities in on how geographic states vote. Sometimes it changes from election to election, but sometimes you will see some similarities in certain regions voting for the same political party, because depending on your geography might also depend on what values and who you support. Then we have the return of the Democrats from 1932 to 1968. Sorry, this visual is making me laugh. Democrats dominate all but 2 presidential elections. I don't know why FDR is doing that with his mouth. There we go. Democrats dominate all but 2 presidential elections. Franklin D. Roosevelt, FDR, is elected president a record 4 times. So again, we now have an amendment in place that does not allow presidents to serve more than 2 terms. But at this time period, that amendment had not yet been put in place, and FDR is elected 4 times. Recent history of politics, so an era of pendulum swings in government. So since 1968, neither Republicans nor Democrats have dominated the presidency, and the Congress has often been controlled by the opposing party. So what do I mean by this? From 1968 to 1976, Republicans hold the presidency. However, Congress is controlled by Democrats, which, again, this can cause problems in getting legislation passed, because a president can bring a bill to Congress, but if Congress does not agree to that bill, then the bill is not going to pass, because again, you need that 2/3 majority vote in Congress for a bill to pass. Then from 1976 to 1980, Democrats hold the presidency, and Congress is also controlled by Democrats. So again, you can get a lot of legislation pushed out when these types of things happen, where both your president and your Congress are controlled by the same party. Then from 1980 to 1992, Republicans hold the presidency, and then the Senate is also controlled by Republicans for a 6-year stretch from 80 to 86. However, then is controlled by Democrats from 86 to 94. We also see this flip again from 92 to 2000. Democrats hold the presidency. However, Congress is controlled by Republicans. And then from 2000 to 2008, Republicans hold the presidency and Congress is controlled by Republicans. And now, more recently, from 2008 to 2016, during President Obama's presidency, Democrats hold the presidency, and then Congress is first controlled by Democrats, but then later Republicans will take control. Now, you might be asking yourself, well, how can Congress flip during a presidential election? Remember, House of Representative candidates are voted in elections every 2 years. Presidents are every 4 years, and senators are every 6 years. So that's how Congress can sway while presidents are still in office, because just the timing of the different elections varies. Minor parties in America, I'll just touch on these quickly. So we have ideological parties, single-issue parties, economic protest parties, and splinter parties. An ideological party would be a party who has a strong ideological belief in an area, and they want to start a party based off of that ideological purpose. I'll give a better example for the single-issue party. So for the single-issue party, maybe they're very supportive of going green or by reducing greenhouse emissions, and they really want to have a strong stance on saving the environment. So you could be a green party, and your stance would be, we're going to save the environment. So that would be a single-issue party where they're in favor of that. An economic protest party are typically parties started when the economy is in trouble. So they want to use the platform of, our economy is not very good, we're going to try to fix our economy, and we're going to try to get people to vote for us by laying out a plan on how to fix our economy. So that'd be an economic protest party. And a splinter party would be a party that is established that kind of breaks off of or splinters from another political party. So for example, Teddy Roosevelt started the Bull Moose Party, which he splintered off from the Republican Party. So they had some of the same ideological ideas, but they wanted to start their own political party. So they splintered off. So it's just an example of some of the different minor parties we can have. What is the importance of minor parties? Spoiler role. They can pull decisive votes away from one of the major parties' candidates. A very famous instance of this was in the 2000 presidential election between George W. Bush and Al Gore, where Ralph Nader, who was for the Green Party, took a lot of votes away from either one side or the other in Florida, and Florida has a lot of electoral votes. And George W. Bush won by, I think, like 538 total votes in Florida, which is a very small margin. So if 539 people would have voted for Al Gore as opposed to George W. Bush, then Al Gore could have won the state of Florida and taken all of those electoral votes. But that did not happen, so George W. Bush took Florida and won that election. So that's a popular idea of they spoil some votes by voting for some minor parties as opposed to the major parties. A critic, they can often take stands on and draw attention to controversial issues that major parties would prefer to ignore. So sometimes the minority parties are like, look, we know this topic is kind of controversial, but we're going to talk about it because we think it needs to be fixed. So maybe the Republican and Democratic parties don't want to talk about an issue, but this group is going to really hammer it home, and they can bring a lot of attention to an issue. Even though their candidates probably are not going to win, they can still raise awareness to an issue, which can be helpful depending on how severe the problem is. And then an innovator, which means they can draw attention to important issues and propose innovative solutions. So sometimes one of these candidates from a minor party might not win, but they might bring up a really good idea that maybe one of the major parties will adopt.